All right, you guys ready? All right, we need timers. Is your machine?
Yes.
You're on. All right. Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn once said, "Until the possible becomes actual, it's only a distraction." What I'm going to do in this first negative speech is examine the whole Affirmative team's case, examine all their harms and advantages, and prove to you that what they claim is only possible, not actual. In theory, it may sound legitimate, but in reality, it simply won't occur. We'll start off with their harms and go to their advantages. Their harm one is that of high deficits, and they had two impacts. I'll address both of these. The first impact was that of fiscal crisis, and they believe that the debt crisis will occur pretty soon. I have two responses. First, tax hikes not merited. Tax hikes not merited. Empirical studies of other countries who have faced debt crisis show us that tax hikes have not worked and have not worked to solve the problem of the debt crisis. Mark Weisbrod, PhD in economics, said in August of 2011, quote, "The U.S. is not facing any public debt crisis at all, with interest payments on the debt at just 1.4% of GDP. Some Eurozone countries do have a debt crisis, but this is only because the Eurozone authorities made it worse by shrinking the economy. There is no legitimate economic reason for a sovereign debt burden to result in years of economic stagnation and high unemployment," unquote. So what the countries in the European Union did is they tried to increase taxes in order to increase revenue to avoid the crisis, exactly what the Affirmative team tries to do. Empirics and history shows us that this is actually an ineffective way to solve the debt crisis, and a debt crisis does not merit years of economic damage because of increased taxes. My partner will be getting a little bit more into how the Affirmative plan harms the economy in his speech. My second response is unrealistic scenario. Unrealistic scenario. Now, a fiscal crisis would essentially be the United States defaulting. This is highly unrealistic, and history actually proves this as well. Last summer, Congress faced the threat of a default, and they were able to cut spending, meaning that Congress would be able to wise up if the threat of a fiscal crisis was actually imminent, and they wouldn't allow the United States to default. They would enact spending cuts in order to avoid the problem. We don't need the tax increases that the Affirmative team implements. So with the fiscal crisis addressed, let's turn to their impact two. Their impact two was that the deficits harm investment in the economy. My response is no substantial evidence. No substantial benefits. The United States has a lot of investment in its economy, and there's no evidence that deficits actually do a substantial harm to this. Laura D. Andre Tyson, a PhD in and professor of economics, said in July 2011, quote, "With substantial excess capacity in the economy, there is no evidence that the federal deficit is driving up interest rates and crowding out private spending," unquote. What this essentially means is that given there's so much investment and money in the economy right now, there's no reason that higher deficits would have a quantifiable and detrimental impact on investment in the economy. That's the state of our current economy right now. Deficits aren't having that great of an effect, and the Affirmative team hasn't actually quantified what this effect is and whether or not it actually harms the economy to a substantial amount. Now with their harm one address, let's turn to their harm two. Their harm two is a market instability, and they had two subpoints and an impact. And specifically, I'm going to address their subpoint B, that high-frequency traders cause volatility, and then they said that that leads to the impact of market crashes. My one response to this harm is that of no volatility. No volatility. Now let's take a look at a study from the Interagency Task Force on Commodity Markets, which is part of the United States federal government, an agency that regulates futures and markets and determines the effect on markets. And Christopher L. Colt, PhD in finance, in March 2010, quote, "The Interagency Task Force on Commodity Markets concluded that speculators, which is high-frequency traders, have not resulted in changes in price over the last 5.5 years. And on the contrary, most speculative traders typically alter their positions following price changes, suggesting that they are responding to new information, just as one would expect an efficiently operating market," unquote. So what this study from this governmental agency is showing us is that high-frequency traders have not been proven to increase volatility. They're just normal traders who are responding to price changes that they don't cause, and that they're responding to it in a way that every other trader would. So these traders that the Affirmative team is talking about aren't anything special, and the government force that actually regulates the market and predicts the market and actually does studies on the market says that these traders do not cause volatility. Therefore, the traders do not cause market crashes either. So this harm by the Affirmative team rather doesn't exist. Now let's turn to their solvency point. Their solvency point was that of historical success. And they talked about the United Kingdom a lot in their speech and cross-examination. I have two responses. First, mostly high-frequency traders. Mostly high-frequency traders. Now interestingly enough, the UK has had an FTT for years and years. And 77% of the United Kingdom's market is made up of high-frequency traders. Bloomberg reported in January 2011, quote, "High-frequency trading accounts for 77% of transactions in UK markets, according to a study by research firm Tab Group, a financial markets research and strategic advisory firm focusing on capital markets, unquote. What exactly does this mean? The empirics, the historical success that the Affirmative team is trying to point to is a country where 77% of their market is made up of these traders that the Affirmative team says is so detrimental to the economy. Now this matters for two reasons. Firstly, the empirics actually side with the negative team, given we can prove that an FTT does not decrease the high-frequency traders like the Affirmative team is trying to say it would. Secondly, because high-frequency trading isn't reduced, the Affirmative team doesn't get their advantage of market stability, their advantage too, and I'll be addressing that a little more in detail in a moment. My second response to this solvency is counter-empirics. Counter-empirics. And we're going to be looking at several countries who instated an FTT, and in fact, they did not decrease volatility. Christopher L. Cupp, PhD in finance, said in March 2010, quote, empirical evidence from China, Finland, Japan, Sweden, Taiwan, and other countries generally supports the notion that non-global FTTs cause trading to migrate, unquote. So essentially what this means is that empirics from about 5 or 6 different countries show that FTTs do not decrease high-frequency traders in that market and actually don't generate revenue and aren't going to be beneficial enough for the market and for the economy that the FTT is in place in. So clearly, empirics actually work against the Affirmative team here, given one, the empirics that they so highly value actually work against them, and two, we have several countries who, as well, separate from the United Kingdom, work against the Affirmative. Now let's turn to their advantage on fiscal security. And I have one simple response, that spending will increase. Spending will increase. Now the Affirmative team believes that we should just throw more money at the government and that they're going to be responsible to reduce the deficit. There's two things wrong with this. Firstly, the government has a tendency to spend all the money it gets and to increase spending, given if we give them more revenue, they're going to feel a little more comfortable with how much they have, and so they'll feel more flexible with increasing spending programs. Secondly, an FTT, one of the main drivers behind the tax in the beginning was so that it could fund more government programs. David John, a senior analyst in financial institutions at Heritage, and Curtis Dubé, a senior tax policy analyst at Heritage, said in January 2012, quote, for a time the tax could raise money, talking about FTT. However, the additional revenue would almost certainly go to fund additional spending rather than reduce the huge federal deficit, unquote. So these are two specific men talking about how the revenue from an FTT, there would be some, but it would go toward more spending, not toward reducing the deficit. So firstly, that's specific to FTT, but secondly, that's just generally what our government does. They get the revenue, and then they feel a little more comfortable, so they feel that they're able to spend more. So the Affirmative plan won't decrease the deficit, therefore they won't avoid the fiscal crisis if one would actually occur. Now finally, let's turn to their advantage to market stability. And I have one response, that if traders unquantified. Traders unquantified. Now there's two quantifications the Affirmative team needs to make that they haven't. Firstly, they need to quantify how many of the high-frequency traders that trade in the U.S. market actually live in the United States. For all we know, all the traders can live in London and be doing trades in the United States. According to the model that the Affirmative team does, if the trader was in London and doing trades in the U.S., they wouldn't be taxed, given they would only be taxed if they lived in the United States. So that's something they need to quantify. Secondly, they need to quantify how much they reduce high-frequency traders, and as a result, if they're still going to get the revenue they claim. So because of these reasons, because they simply don't have any harm standing and their advantages won't become about, I would ask for a negative. Thank you. Now, any questions by the Affirmative speaker?
Ready? And all right, how are you doing today, Grayson?
I'm doing great, Mikayla. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good too. Just a few questions about your speech. First off, how high is the debt right now?
$15.5 trillion.
All right, thank you. Moving on, would you agree that we need revenue on top of spending cuts to avoid the fiscal crisis?
Well, not necessarily. One way that you could get revenue is by cutting waste, and that would gain revenue, but it's my argument that just throwing more money at the government will just increase their spending programs, and history shows us this, and specifically the FTT shows us this as well.
All right, thank you. Moving on to that spending argument, would you agree that there is political gridlock in Congress?
There is some, but political gridlock doesn't last for years and years. Even in the long term, if Congress did spend your money to increase spending, that would mean that you wouldn't get the fiscal crisis avoided that you claim.
But is it your argument that as soon as the government gets the money that they're going to spend it right away?
Not necessarily. My argument is that there will be a time when the Congress is just going to spend the money on new spending programs, and whether that's short term or long term, it means you're not going to get your advantage.
All right, so you don't know when the government would spend the money?
Specifically, no, but either way, you don't get your advantage.
All right, thank you. Moving on, can I see your evidence about tax hikes not merited?
Yeah.
Thank you. Mind if I take this back?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so why do we not decrease volatility under our plan, or why do high-frequency traders not cause volatility?
Well, the high-frequency traders don't cause volatility because they're just acting as normal traders in the market, and the study by the United States agency, the government agency on this, conducted the study, and that was their conclusion.
But won't you agree that high-frequency traders are passing items back and forth and just artificially pushing them to raise the prices?
Well, that's the argument you're making. The government agency happens to disagree with you.
All right, thank you. Moving on, would you agree that high-frequency trading is bad for the market?
No, I don't agree, because you say that the United Kingdom has one of the best markets in the world, and 77% of their market is high-frequency traders.
Okay, so do you think that high-frequency trading is specifically good for the market?
Well,
then?
my partner's going to be addressing that in his speech.
All right, thank you. Did you bring him any evidence saying that high-frequency trading did not cause the 2008 market crash?
Your link to the 2008 market crash was that they caused volatility, so when I address volatility, that addresses your impact as well.
All right, thank you. Moving on to your argument about the UK, could I see that piece of evidence about high-frequency trading?
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. And also, was that evidence talking about the London Stock Exchange?
It was talking about the market in the United Kingdom.
So specifically about the London Stock Exchange?
I believe so, yes.
All right, thank you. And about your empirics about how the FTT has failed in other countries, can I see those empirics?
Yeah.
Also, did this state specific countries in here?
Yes, it did. It said China, Finland, Taiwan, Sweden, one other, and then it just said other countries as well.
All right, thank you.